Thank you so much, Mala. I really appreciate your kind comments. Before starting the presentation, I wanted to give a quick introduction about myself. I'm currently working at Microsoft. One of the things that I'm really proud of, apart from the work that we do at Microsoft, is that I also am a co-teacher at the TEALS program, which is a volunteer organization, and they reach out to individuals that may have domain expertise. So for example, I co-teach Java, and it just takes some of the time, part of your time, and you help these underserved communities, especially for me. I'm reaching out to a school in El Paso, and it's an all-girls school. So I'm really, really excited about this opportunity. I'll be teaching at high school level, and I really encourage people to give back to the community. So I also do first Lego League coaching and stuff like that. So with that out of the way, because I'm really passionate about volunteering and giving back, so I really encourage that. And I would like to start my presentation now. Once again, thank you for having me here. I appreciate everybody joining in to watch this presentation live, or maybe at a later time when it's recorded and replayed. So today I want to talk about, as Mala already mentioned, I'm going to talk about the newer garbage collectors. And I'm going to start from the current default, which is the G1 GC first garbage collector. When Mala mentioned about in the past, she had seen one of the presentations, especially the G1 GC. I used to work for Sun Oracle, and I was the G1 GC performance lead. So it became a passion of mine to kind of talk from the performance perspective and from a little bit of technical stuff, but why does it matter? Why do all these technical details matter, and how does it affect performance? So that's how I got into the talking circuit in a way, and I like to today I'd like to compare and contrast different collectors. I want to start with kind of what does it mean when we say STW, which is stop the world, versus concurrent collection. What is regionalized heap versus and generational heap mean? And then also cover some of the commonalities between all these newer collectors. What if we get time, I'll also want to compare and contrast these collectors. So I'll give a quick introduction and then talk about how they differ, like in their compaction algorithm or in the way that the barriers are handled. Okay, if there are questions, please keep them coming in. I know if we have a lot of questions, then it'll be okay to interrupt me as well. So here we go. So let's talk about stop the world versus concurrent collections. With I think JDK 9 plus, I think it was in JDK 10, there was this concept of thread local handshakes that was introduced. Previously, stop the world would always mean stopping all of the application threads and then doing the garbage collection work. So you have to bring the threads to a safe point. The threads take their own time to reach a proper point where they can hand over and like come to a halt and hand over the execution. And this would be, and I will show you the differences here, but this would be something that was not acceptable. So with JDK 10, there was the concept of thread local handshakes that was introduced. So here you see some application threads running, and then a safe point is requested. This is where we say the stop the world concept, so which means stop all your mutated threads. They're called mutated threads because they're mutating. It's your application threads that mutate the live object graph. Okay. So as I mentioned, all these threads take their own time to come to a halt. With the introduction of handshakes, basically what we do is like the GC threads will now get the information from the application threads, from your mutators, about the, say, mark stack or something, right? So this is the small tasks that are done so that they can get enough information, GC threads can get enough information from the mutators to be able to continue the GC work, okay? And then the application threads resume, and then GC threads are working in the background. So you really, the stop the world is not really a concept anymore with respect to thread local handshakes, because it's like just stopping each thread for a brief amount of time to be able to communicate between the mutators and the GC, and then the world resumes itself, right? And then GC takes its time, it's working concurrently, and here it gets done. And now to just compare the new concept with the older stop the world concept, the same application threads, after a save point is requested, will take their own time to come to a halt. And that time is called time to save point. Unfortunately, this particular thread here, let me see if I can get a highlighter here. So unfortunately, this particular thread here took the longest time to come to a stop. And that is the one that dominated our time to save point here. Okay. And then GC threads will start the work, because that's when the execution was transferred to the GC threads, and the GC threads are done, and your application threads will resume now. So this whole area that I've highlighted here is what is called your stop the world period, where it's basically your application thread is doing nothing. So it affects your throughput directly, depending on how long this period is. So this is a great addition to the garbage collectors post JDK 10, I think. So, and you will get it for free because it's enabled by default. Now, let's compare stop the world and thread local handshakes with concurrent GC. Your same application threads are running, and they fill up the heap in the sense that, or they reach a threshold where now we have to start a garbage collection. We have a brief stop the world pause. This could be replaced with thread local handshakes as well, and that is mostly for all these GCs. We call it the initial mark phase. The GC threads go and identify the routes, and I'll talk about that, how the route identification and everything is done. And then the GC threads work concurrently, application threads resume, and then eventually, after the GC completes its concurrent work, it will go and look, there'll be a remark pause, again, stop the world or thread local handshakes, and the GC threads will identify anything that had the live object graph that has been changed during the concurrent phase. And GC threads will again go back to background concurrent activity, and application threads will resume. So as you can see, the GC threads and application threads do work together, and since the GC threads are working concurrently with mutated threads, that's called concurrent garbage collector. The newer garbage collector, not only to the marking in a concurrent fashion, but they also do concurrent compaction, and we'll talk about that soon. Now, there's another concept. Since G1 GC, the concept of regionalized heap was introduced, and I want to talk about that because all the newer collectors are regionalized. And so what is that? What does regionalized mean? We have our heap, and this is something that everybody is used to since, since the beginning of Java time, right? We have the heap, that's a contiguous space. Regionalized just means that the same contiguous space is now divided into regions. These regions could be equal sized in G1 GC's case, or it could be variable, and depending on how the garbage collector adjusts itself, this will be dependent on each garbage collector. Now, I also want to introduce the concept of generational. Okay, so same heap could be divided into young generation and old generation. And this is what I mean by generational heap. The concept of generational garbage collector is that most objects die young. So this is the weak generational hypothesis. If you ever hear somebody talk about that, it basically means that as you allocate objects, most of them will die young. So given enough time, these are all transient, or most objects are transient, and you do not have to retain them. So most of them will not form your live data set. So if you divide your heap into generations, your young generation, the Eden and survivor space, can act like a sieve, and it'll age your objects in the young generation, and you only promote either the long-lived transient or your actual live data set. So this is great, and G1GC is one of the collectors that does have, it is generational, as I've shown here. So ZGC and Shenandoah for now are not generational, but they are regionalized, and G1GC is regionalized and generational. Yeah, and so many of the times when you are comparing them, just keep that in mind, that you are getting the throughput advantage in G1GC because of the generational heap. Okay. The other thing to keep in mind is that the region sizes, ZGC is a little more advanced in the way it configures region sizes for objects and stuff like that. And G1GC only has this kind of humongous regions, and we don't have time in this session to talk more about G1GC, but just there's certain things with respect to the regions that where we can look for performance advantages, or when performance drops as well. So the second concept of these garbage collectors is the concept of copying collector. Whether you're a generational collector, which means that you're doing a young scavenge. Scavenge is basically looking for live objects, basically. Or you're doing a copying collector because you're trying to reclaim space, right? The concept is similar. So you have a from space and you have a to space, and that's what you do. You kind of move it back and forth. You move the live objects back and forth. And as I mentioned in the generational collector, that acts as a seed to only promote long-lived objects, right? So let's look at how that works. We call these kind of collectors as copying collectors or evacuating collectors, because we are evacuating from one region, from one area, from one space to the other. So the same heap again has from space and to space. And as your heap starts getting filled with objects, so here I'm showing the objects coming in green, and O represents objects. Now our from space is filled, and we want to start a collection cycle. The way we start a collection cycle is by marking. It's a tracing collector, so we are tracing live objects, okay? So for that, we need to identify something called GC roots. So GC roots are basically your static variables, your static variables, or your threads, locals, and any kind of like intern strings and class loader references and stuff like that. So JNI references as well. So we start from the roots. So here I've shown some of the root, some objects here in the GC roots, and then we have root objects here. So basically we've identified root objects on the heap inside the from space. So now that we have traced and we have formed our own live object graph, it's easier for us to understand that those are the live objects that we need to retain, and then we can reclaim the from space, okay? So that's exactly what we're gonna do next. We're gonna move those live objects, and that's why it's called copying collector, because we're literally moving it from the from space to the to space, okay? And we can reclaim the from space back. Now, because I mentioned about the back and forth concept, right? So now we have moved our live objects, the from space is reclaimed. We can now call the to space, the past to space, we can rename it as now from space, and the past from space is now the to space. So basically the arrow just turns backwards. So now we're going again from, let me use the laser pointer here. We're going from the from space to the to space, okay? And we start this all over again. So we keep on, and this is the concept of sieving that I was talking about. So you keep on moving live objects, and usually there's an age threshold that's associated with these objects. And once they pass the default threshold, I think it's 15, then they get promoted into the old gen if it's a generational collector. Okay. The second commonality that I wanted to cover was the concept of regions and what do occupied and free regions mean in these collectors, in the newer collectors. So again, going back to our heap, we have a bunch of regions, and I'm trying to introduce the same concepts that I had introduced earlier. Green is basically when objects are coming in, and O represents objects. So if so this is my heap, okay, but at any given time you won't see these all bunched together. What you would see is at any given time you have a heap that's regionalized and a bunch of regions that are occupied, okay. And the way we understand free regions is by a list of free regions, basically. So it's a simple bump the pointer, and that gives us the whereabouts of our free regions. So if I had to talk more about G1GC here briefly, and I talked about how the humongous objects are, humongous regions are a different concept in G1GC. Basically, at any given time, you would see these occupied regions could be from the young generation or the old generation, or these could be the humongous regions that I was talking about. Humongous objects are objects that are 50% or more of a region size. So going back to the laser pointer here, this down here could be a humongous object, and it needed contiguous. It needed two regions basically that have to be contiguous so that we can put in the object. And usually, humongous object, not usually, but always humongous object, is allocated out of the old generation because you don't want to spend time copying. Because remember the concept of from and to space, we are acting as sieve. But we're literally moving the object from one space to the other. And this gets very expensive for large objects. So we don't want to do it. It stays put in the old generation until it's reclaimed. The second set of commonalities is how do we reclaim objects, right? And what does it mean to have a collection set? And how do we prioritize this reclamation? Okay. So going back to our concept of the heap, free and occupied regions, what I've done is now I've populated the regions that are occupied with objects again. And what the highlighted objects, for example, these right here, right? And then these two up here, this entire region here, this entire region here, these two up here. These kind of highlighted regions are the ones that are live. So I've already done the marking. I've already identified the live objects. Okay. So what we see here, this region here and this region here doesn't have any live objects. So we can reclaim them right when we are trying to do the cleanup. Okay. So with cleanup, I am done. I have reclaimed that space already. The second thing we see are these two are sparsely live. So basically each of them in this example only has one live object. So we can collect them. So we move that live object into this new space right here, and we can reclaim those two regions and kind of collect them here. So basically that's the whole concept of how reclamation is done in these kind of regionalized collectors. The number one priority is to reclaim regions with the most garbage, okay? And how do we do that? How do we identify these candidate regions? We basically do the marking, and then we kind of, in G1's case, for example, we arrange them from the most to the least, like objects and expense, right, or whatever. And then we just go simply up or down that array, and it's simply whatever is the cheapest to get back, because we don't want to spend time copying, especially if it's a stop the world, remember, and it doesn't do any thread local, or it didn't do in the past, right? So that is a lot of time spent copying, and we want to avoid that. The regions that we're going to reclaim during a pause are said to be in a collection set. So we identify the identify the cheapest regions that we can reclaim, and that is kept in a collection set where those will be the regions that will be reclaimed. There are thresholds on how these, I talked about how they're arranged, right? But there are thresholds on how and where we stop collection. Of course, there's the whole time concept, right? We don't want to go past X amount, whatever is set on the command line, or the default, which is 200, and I'll talk about this in a tabular fashion. So it's 200 milliseconds for G1 GC, for example. So the other thresholds are like, if a region is getting too expensive, if it's 95% filled with live objects, we don't want to spend time moving all those live objects into a new region. So we will let that region be. The second concept is, how populated is my heap? You know, is my old gen really seeing the pressure? And I really need to reclaim a lot of old gen, or I'm okay with keeping some garbage around, like let the garbage be floating around in the ocean, and that's a concept of floating garbage. So these are all thresholds that we kind of maintain, and that's how the adaptiveness of the garbage collector is controlled. So in the past, if you've seen me talk about G1 GC, I do talk about these thresholds in detail, because that's where anybody trying to get the last few percentage of performance, if it's like throughput driven or latency sensitive, then those are the thresholds that you would play with. Okay. Because we are because of this regionalized concept, it's very easy now to control your unit of work, right? A unit of work is not an entire generation, or it's not your card table or whatever. Now it's specifically this region. So literally a collection set could have one region only, right, conceptually, or it could have a multiple set of regions. This renders itself very suitable for something called incremental collection. So we do not always have to collect the entire heap or the entire generation. We can do it incrementally so that we are pastime sensitive. And this kind of the concept of incremental compaction, or people call it partial compaction, or people call it incremental collection. All these are true for G1, Shenandoah, and ZGC. And as I talked about thresholds, these incremental collections are definitely threshold driven, because when do you stop collecting is a question that you need to answer, and these thresholds are the way you answer that question. And basically, when you either reach a reclamation threshold or the freeness of the old generation in G1's case, then that's when you stop. And because I already introduced the concept of stop the world versus third local handshakes, so this particular reclamation doesn't really need to be stop the world at all. And as you will see in G1 GC, in ZGC and Shenandoah, it's actually not stop the world at all. So now with the groundwork done, let's compare and contrast these different collectors that I was talking about. So what I've done here is I have basically whatever we discussed until now, and added the algorithm type as well, because that's where the collectors differ. So based on regionalized or not, generational or not, what kind of compaction do we do, and what's the target pastime? Let's compare these algorithms. In G1 GC, yes, it's regionalized, as we saw. Yes, it's generational. And it does do compaction where it's the forwarding address, basically where are we going to move to? Remember, from space and to space. That forwarding address is in the header of an object. In HotSpot, all objects have a header. That's where you store information about locks and about forwarding pointers or marked or not. I will go into a little bit of details shortly, but something to know is like when you have those value types, and you talk about the flat structure, they will not have headers. And so that's a different concept. When we talk about value types in the future, people will cover more details on that. But for now, we know that there are headers, and that's very useful for us with respect to compaction. Target pass time for G1 is 200 milliseconds, as I mentioned. And the algorithm that it uses for concurrent marking is called snapshot at the beginning. I'll briefly cover what that is here, but please feel free to read and understand more about it because it's a very interesting concept. Comparing now the G1 GC with Shenandoah. Of course, Shenandoah is also regionalized, but as I mentioned, it's not yet generational. Compaction, it does have the concept of forwarding pointer as well, but the compaction, the main difference is that G1 GC does stop the world compaction, and Shenandoah does concurrent compaction, and which makes it even more difficult, but it makes it more latency sensitive, right? G1 GC is geared, as you can tell from the target pass times, G1 GC is geared towards like not a tighter pass time, but maintaining your throughput. So if your SLAs are throughput driven and while maintaining a little bit of leniency in latency sensitivity, then G1 is your choice. Otherwise, you go for these more low latency sensitive collectors like Shenandoah and ZGC. So here's ZGC. There's the concept of colored pointers, but compaction is also done concurrently, similar to Shenandoah. Target pass times are similar to Shenandoah, and the concurrent marking algorithm is a little bit different, and I'll cover that briefly as well. So the next section, I want to highlight differences, but I want to talk about those in terms of GC phases, the marking algorithm itself, any barriers that may be different, and the compaction, which stop the world versus concurrent. So G1 GC first, these are the stages that you can see here. So you have the initial mark, the root region scanning, the marking, the final mark, which is also known as remark, and then there's a cleanup, which can be concurrent as well. And then after you're done with marking, and remember I was talking about how if a region is full of garbage, it can be collected in during the cleanup phase. So that's exactly what this cleanup is right here. Okay, and then in the compaction phase, we move the regions that are least expensive into the newer regions, so that we achieve compaction, right? So this is kind of already covered when I was giving the details about the from and to regions, as well as about reclamation and collection set. So let's quickly look at snapshot at the beginning algorithm. So the whole, because it's concurrent algorithm and we're working with the mutate, the GC threads are working with the mutators, we have to have certain assumptions here, so it's about considering objects implicitly live or explicitly marking them. So objects that are allocated during the marking phase, during the concurrent marking phase, will be considered live. So they're implicitly considered live and they're not traced. Okay, so that's how we reduce the marking overhead. And that's the whole concept of snapshot. So basically, at the beginning of your marking phase, you take a logical snapshot of the heap. Okay. Again, as I mentioned, anything that is present, the garbage that is there will be identified. But as the application, as the mutated threads mutate the object graph, we will consider those new these new objects to be implicitly live. Okay, and if there's a reference update, we just log that in a log queue, and then we process that later. There are two barriers right now for this particular one for the reference update. It's called a pre-write barrier. As I mentioned, please, this is just an overview. If you want to read more about that, please go. There's a presentation that I did at JFocus in 2017, as well as there's the book, the Java Performance Companion, which talks about G1 GC in detail. So let's look at the pre-write barrier very quickly. For anything that's something of the form x.f = y, right? And if marking is active, So that's an optimization right there. Right? If it's not marking, then you don't need to even go in that if loop, right? So you just say if marking is active, then you store that previous value, okay? And if it's null, then if it's not null, then you have to put it in the log queue. Remember I mentioned, so basically enqueue that in the SATB log buffer, and then you're done. So that's the simplest barrier that you have, the pre-write barrier in G1 GC. And of course, anything that uses the SATB algorithm will also have the same barriers. There's also a concept of post-write barrier, and that comes with remembered sets. So remembered sets are basically for each region, you have the concept of, let me find out all the incoming pointers into the region, right? So that's the concept of remembered sets. We don't have time to cover that here, but I want to talk about the barrier. So if you have something like this, like object field is equal to some other object field, G1 GC will issue a write barrier. And then you just basically, all simple thing is to do is a check right there. If it's evaluates to 0, a barrier is not needed. Otherwise, you need a barrier. So again, these are optimized already. There's a log buffer again for remembered sets. You just put that enqueue the card in the log buffer. And the concept of card marking and everything is like, you know, the GC handbook is the de facto book that you should go read about card tables and all those things to understand more details, because this is the commonality for garbage collectors in OpenJDK. How does compaction happen in G1 GC? I was talking about the Java object, right? Let's not think about value types right now, but let's just talk about the Java object with header, okay? Header usually has two different, the header word has two different words here. They have the mark word, which I was talking about. Remember, during marking, we need that kind of information. And a pointer to instance class, which is an internal representation of HotSpot. Okay. In the mark word itself, you have the pointer, and then there are 2 bits. So what happens is that the GC workers will take, you know, there's the work stealing and whatnot, but let's just say that they compete to install the forwarding pointer. So wherever it's pointing to is installed in the mark word right there. And if you need to look at the source, just have to look at the VM representation of instance class. And when it's marked, the bits will be a 1, 1 right there. And that's about it. Now, let's look at ZGC next, okay? The same table, but here it's identifying different concurrent phases. So remember, G1 GC had STW compaction, like stop the world compaction. But in ZGC, you have the compaction is done concurrently. So you have the compaction broken down into 3 phases. You have the prepare phase, the start compaction phase, and the concurrent compaction phase. There's also another phase called the remap, which is done concurrently with the next cycle. So it's kind of, that's an optimization right there already. In the remark phase, you just basically fix up the pointers. Again, because we're doing this, the whole copying and compaction in a concurrent fashion, there's a lot of mutation already. So you want to fix up the pointers, and that's when we need the remap phase. To learn more about that, a little bit more details, you can see Per's slides. He presented that at JFocus 2018. Let's look at concurrent marking in the detail here. So the GC threads, each of them work on their own stripe. So the entire heap, no matter how big it is, how huge it is, each GC thread will work on their own area, so to speak. So kind of we're trying to avoid shared state. So if you have more threads, then there's more concurrency that we need to keep an account of, and then whenever you're sharing between the threads, then there's a concept of, like, you know, having the concurrent overhead. So we're trying to minimize that. And then there's the concept of load barriers, where we want to see loads of non-marked object pointers, but these barriers are only kept to object pointers, and we'll talk more about what that means. ZGC also, because of ZGC, the thread local handshakes concept was introduced. It's also used by G1 GC. If I had to draw what I just said, it would look something like this. Your heap is, and then you have these GC threads up till n, and then your heap is divided. Is logical stripes right there, and each GC thread basically, so thread 0, 1, n, thread 0, 1, n, 0, 1, n. So these kind of let each thread has its own workspace stack, sort of, to keep the concurrent overhead to a minimum. So I mentioned about the barrier. Remember the object reference? So there's a load barrier for object references. So let's look at that here. All you have to understand from when people talk about loaded reference barrier or loaded value barrier is the concept of updating a bad reference to a good reference. Okay, and who does the work? It doesn't really matter. So basically, you can have the mutators do the work of updating a bad reference to a good reference, or the GC threads will do the work. So that's the concept of self-healing, right? When the mutators actually do the work, that's called self-healing. So this kind of LRB is based on a couple of invariants. The simplest thing to know is that writes and reads will always happen into the to space, right? Into or from. So if you're writing into, you're going to write into this to space, which is the new space, right? And then if you're reading, it's also from the to space. So we always say that the guarantee is that the to space is the most current copy, right? And that's called a strong to space invariant. So the other guarantee is that anytime you have a loaded reference value, we make sure it's the responsibility of whoever encounters that to make sure that it's marked through. Okay, and that's when I talked about the if the mutator didn't do it, then it's a collector's responsibility to do that. So, and that's a guarantee that the collector provides to you. Just based on these concepts, the loaded reference barrier has provides very low overhead. And to learn more about that, there is this paper by Bill Tenney. This is the concept that is also in the C4, the continuously concurrent compacting collector. I strongly encourage you to read the paper, and it's very informative. So here's an example of how the object reference, the barrier works. You have an object reference load from the heap, and then you introduce the load barrier. So again, the idea is to have a bad reference changed into a good reference, right? And to look at the example here, again, it's from Per's slide. So I'm just using that. And here's how the assembly looks. I'm sorry to get into the details, but it's kind of much more clearer when I show the assembly code. So you have the object, like I mentioned, and is it a bad color? Yes. Then you have to go the slow path. Otherwise, you're done. So you go back your merry way. So it's as easy as just a test, basically. Let's look at some of the core concepts of ZGC. It's the concept of colored pointers. You have the object address, and we have on 41 right now. And some of the top bits are ignored, are unused. And there's like the other bits in between are used specifically for marking. So is the object known to be marked? Is it in the remapped phase? Or is it finalized, if its object is finalizable. So basically, if it's final reachable or like about to be finalized or whatever. So if it's reachable to a finalizer. Again, more details on Per's presentation here. So the metadata, this is this whole tag bits are called metadata, and then they are used in the, these are used as 4 bits that I showed you. Those are the unused part of the 64-bit pointer. So as you can see, the object range is only from 0 to, the object address is only from 0 to 41. And that's how ZGC is right now. To learn more about that, I strongly encourage you to understand the concept of virtual mapping, which is what it's called multi-mapping on x86-64. There's some hardware support on Spark and on 64, which does away with the multi-map concept on those, because you just use the tag bits to directly point to the area you want. Concurrent compaction. Again, this is very difficult. Concurrent compaction becomes very difficult because your mutator is changing the object graph. So you need a load barrier to detect object pointers, which I already explained earlier. Self-healing, the concept of self-healing is when the mutators help out, right? The GC threads, hey, I can see that I need to do this move here, and so I'm going to help them do this myself. What is interesting about ZGC is that it has off-heap forwarding tables, which can help you reclaim the heap right away, reclaim and reuse the heap right away. So that's one of the things that you would see that it is very advantageous, especially when you have larger heap pools, forwarding tables. Moving on to Shenandoah, you will see some of the stages that the concurrent concepts are similar to ZGCs. You have initial update, a concurrent update, and the final update. Final update is where you update the routes into the 2 regions, remember, because there are the concept of mutation and GC working together. And then eventually there's the concept of cleanup, which we saw in G1GC's case as well, where you free the collection set, free regions in the collection set. So, to get more details, there is the whole, it's a page dedicated by the Shenandoah team. Please go ahead and look at the openjdk.java.net Shenandoah page, and they have the most up-to-date information over there. I already spoke about the concurrent marking algorithm, which is similar to G1GC. So I'm just gonna this is just a reminder for that. To read more about that, please go ahead and look at the presentation listed here. We spoke about pre-write barriers for the snapshot at the beginning. Just to recap, it's needed for all updates, and you do a quick check to see if marking is active, and then you enqueue it. Now, this is the concept for concurrent compaction. Remember, because concurrent compaction is happening along with the mutators. So you need a read barrier there. And to read more about that, there's a paper listed right here. It just talks about how the read barrier, and I showed you an example of how that works. And then, what was interesting in Shenandoah's case, the paper and everything, all these concepts were mentioned in the paper, and then Shenandoah had a change in algorithm. So this all gets superseded. So this paper is really good academically to learn about all the barriers and everything, but all this information is superseded now. So when you look at the tip right now and you try to get information for Shenandoah from there, you will find the same concept of loaded reference barrier, the LRBs that I had explained earlier in ZGC's case. So again, the concept is introduced beautifully in this paper here. What we have to do, let's recap. We have to make sure that we ensure strong 2-space invariant, right? And utilize barriers at reference load. And if you go fast path, because if it's not a bad reference, remember, we can take the fast path. If it's a bad reference, then we have to stop and do the slow path. Okay. For concurrent compaction, again, this has been superseded, but I wanted to talk about Brooks-style indirection pointer because, again, that's what the paper will talk about when you look at Shenandoah paper. You have the same Java object with body and header, but with Shenandoah, with Brooks-style pointer, indirection pointer, you have an additional pointer overhead to each Java object. When it's not in the from to space kind of movement area, The indirection pointer just points to the object itself. And then what you have to do is that there is work every time that you want to access an object, you have to dereference, right? So there's an additional work of overhead of that, and that's a memory and throughput costs right there. So this concept has been superseded as well. And now they just use the concept of forwarding pointer in the header. So you have the from space and the to space copy. You have the Java object body and the header. So what we do is that instead of in the from space, we just install the forwarding pointer. So basically we're pointing to the to space, and that's simple as that. So anybody looking at the from space will always be pointed to the to space, and that's exactly what I was talking about with respect to the to space invariant. Okay, this is of course has its advantages with respect to performance, because in the previous state of this, when you had the indirection pointer, there was a super dereference was the overhead as well as footprint overhead. Right? Let's look at performance quickly. I want to be conscious of time. So what I've done, this is Spec JVB 2015. A quick overview of JVB 2015 is that what you see here is higher is better, because they talk about operations per second. So it's a throughput. The numbers are always in throughput. The way Spec JVB works is that it looks at system capacity first. So that's what I'm showing as full system capacity. And then it tries to meet responsiveness SLAs. So what I'm showing with respect to the light blue is the responsiveness SLA. So one of the things that I wanted to highlight here is that in OpenJDK 8, the default collector, garbage collector was the throughput collector, right? Which is also known as parallel GC or parallel. And with 11, when people started testing with 11, out of box, you get G1GC. So you not only get G1GC, you also get less variability. So run-to-run variability reduces drastically for things that are throughput sensitive, as well as have the system level agreements, the SLOs constraints. And here I've also shown the standard deviation. The other thing, again, is to look out for out-of-box. When you're looking at out-of-box performance and you're doing a comparison, you will see that there are a lot of improvements that have been made to G1GC ever since it became the default. And I talked about one of them being the thread local handshakes, right? So we no longer have to wait for all the threads to come to a halt, all the mutator threads to come to a halt. We can do an individual handshake level. That's just one of the improvements. So here, again, higher is better. And you can see that G1GC gives better throughput under responsiveness constraints. That's when I talk about responsiveness right here. The other thing to keep in mind is, I always talk about this with everybody that I meet, is innovation happens at tip. So even though you think that, oh, G1GC is the default, it's stable, but there are improvements that happen to G1GC as if you compare to any given version. And the best way to read about it is by reading at when a build releases, you just read about what all of the things that went into that. So these are called JEPs is the best way to. So these are called Java Enhancement Proposals, JEPs. So I strongly encourage you to read that. But here what I'm showing is parallel GC, G1GC, and ZGC compared to TIP and 11. So JDK 11 is the LTS, long-term supported release. And I was comparing TIP to that, and you can already see that innovation is happening. So again, higher is better, and you already see better full system capacity, as well as responsiveness for all three collectors. The reason I'm not showing Shenandoah here is Shenandoah is not in JDK 11. Yeah, it's not in JDK 11. So it was, as an experimental GC, it came out in JDK 12. So the next set of results should show that. So here I'm comparing full just system capacity with responsiveness. And it's kind of like, again, my whole idea is the out-of-box experience as the end user would see it. So what I've done is I've kept tuning to a minimal. And so when I say right here, I say G1 GC base, which means that's my baseline, where I only give it nursery, because remember, parallel GC and G1 GC are generational, so they do depend on your young gen size, which is also known as nursery. And right here, I've just given the new gen, that's the size, right? A little bit of new gen size here. In parallel GC's case, I gave a baseline with a little bit of XMN, which is basically your initial nursery and your max nursery is the same. So I just gave it right there. And I also played with the same options between the two, the same generational options between the two. As you can see, G1GC is maintaining its responsiveness, and it's doing pretty well in throughput as well. What we see here is ZGC is shining with respect to the responsiveness, because I talked about the concepts with respect to how it can do a larger heap can be handled much efficiently, and it can be reclaimed and written back to the forwarding because of the off-heap forwarding tables. I think that's my last slide. The next step is to go ahead and improve your knowledge on all these things. These are some of the places that I looked for the information that I have provided here. And yeah, I hope if you have any questions, you will reach out, as well as thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Monica. It was amazing. And we have loads of interesting questions for you.
Sure, that'd be great.
Yes, so I think the viewers are happy to know about a lot of other options that they would have apart from G1. And because, as we know, a lot of production systems, they are still on Java 8. So, of course, they have another reason to upgrade to Java 11, the next LTS. One question which was asked in many formats was to best tools to compare these collectors. Like if a person wants to use them and want to compare how they fare against memory leaks or multi-threading or parallelism. So what tools would you suggest?
Yeah, so anything that can visualize GC log is your number one tool. So the way I like to visualize, or I like to look at GC log, is in a histogram. I think I see somebody mentioned about histogram. So basically it gives you a layout from the start of your JVM till the end of the JVM, if you had stopped the world pauses, for example, or any kind of concurrent activity. So you kind of look at the histogram and all that information. So from a JVM's perspective, you have all the logging information available. Any tool out there that can visualize these logs is your to-go tool for that. In the past, I myself have only used parsers that I've written because I work on the tip and as well as trying to look for innovations. So I write my own parsers, but there are very many online tools that you can just look for GC log visualization and you'll find them. So I do internally at Microsoft, we have acquired JClarity. So we have JClarity tools, and we're trying to see how we can best, provide them to the community. We're still looking at that. But so I don't have a perfect recommendation today, but go ahead and Google visualization tools for GC logs, and you will find many.
Right, makes sense. The other question is, would a garbage collector work differently when Java JVM is started on a server versus a client? And would the duration of the application running or the server running, would that make a difference?
So from a garbage, that's a very good question, because we're trying to understand it from a user perspective, right? I really appreciate that question. So from a user perspective and from an application perspective, the only thing that OpenJDK HotSpot does is identify the client, server, or a client or server option. So if you have a client VM, that's we use the C1 compiler, JIT compiler, and if it's a server VM, then we use the C2 compiler. So there's a whole concept of jitting that's different between the client and the server. From garbage collection perspective, the only difference is in the collector that we use. And I have not covered the client collector here. The client collector that we use is called the serial garbage collector, which is single threaded, and it is generational. So basically, it's your single threaded version of your parallel collector. It's in the simplest form. So that's the client collector. Now, how do we measure the impact, right? How does it matter how long the application runs? From a garbage collector perspective, what I didn't cover here, and we will go that when I talk about only performance, I will talk about this in details. But it's your allocation rate. It's your live data set. Remember how we talked about the concept of sieving and kind of only promoting long-lived transients, right? So that is the concept that matters to the application, and from the application's perspective, not the length of time, but how fast the allocation is happening. How can the garbage collector keep up? Remember those thresholds? What if the garbage collector is not, the thresholds don't get triggered and you're now filling up the entire heap, right? So those kind of things matter from the performance perspective.
Right, makes sense. So there's another question which is related to this. So are there any common traps with the GCs? Like if as you mentioned, that it is not about, at times the threshold might not be reached. So are we looking at a certain set of conditions which we should be looking at? Is there a pattern? Like this happens when you are running a garbage collector on this system with certain parameters. Do we already have this documented, or a pattern?
It is, but I still look at applications that are different, that they do not follow the norms that we kind of come up with this pattern, right? The whole concept of, for example, generational heap is the regen hypothesis, which is most objects die young. What if your objects don't die young? What if you're collecting and you're playing with, so you're creating a cache, for example, and then you're just like ping-ponging the cache, right? So everything gets promoted into the old generation, the whole idea of allocation and keeping, aging them in the young generation. So these thresholds are there to have these default assumptions met. But if your application is not the default kind of applications, and so each of these concepts are different. So the best way, and my recommendation to everybody, is go talk about your use case. If it's performing well, great. So let us know about that as well. But if it's not performing well, go to the OpenJDK aliases such as HotSpot GC use. So HotSpot GC use is the alias. Let me see if I can quickly write it over here. Pen. Hotspot is the virtual machine. So hotspot, sorry, my writing looks really bad. GC, okay, and then use. Okay, that's the alias at openjdk.java.net. Please go there, talk about your use case. I am pretty sure people will jump in to help, right? Because most of the applications have their very specific use case. But we're also working towards adaptive algorithms. So your use case will help us make GC more adaptive as well. So please go ahead and provide us your use cases.
Absolutely. So there's one question which I would like to take, which is a question on the off heap area. So the question is that I see that the JVM now uses a lot of off heap memory. Is it possible to restrict that? For example, if the person allocates 1 GB RAM to Tomcat, the person can see via top that it is using 4 GB.
Okay. Well, it depends on some of it is because of the structures, the maintenance overhead of these concurrent collectors. Each collector comes with its overhead, right? When I talked about from and to spaces, that's an overhead, right? Because you're literally keeping this to space around, and then you're keeping the from space around, and you're just going back and forth. Although your objects are just actually your liveness or whatever is just fixed to a range, but you're doubling the range because of the from and to space. These are the things like remembered sets. I talked about SATV log buffers. Remember the log buffers we talked about? The forwarding tables, because each of these you have to understand and associate when you're doing concurrently what goes where, right? So it's kind of an overhead we're paying for improving concurrency for improving the latency, the response to latency. So as you go more and more away and more sophisticated algorithms, more adaptive algorithms, you have the concept of outside the heap structures that are used for maintenance of the heap of the GC. So what we do is like the whole idea, if you want to keep and restrict your footprint, then you use a collector like a serial GC. And if you have little more area to spare, then you use parallel GC. But as you go more towards the concurrent collectors, you will have a little more overhead.
Thank you so much, Monica. It was interesting as usual. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate that.
Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate your time as well. Thanks.
Bye. Take care.